Leading, supporting, collaborating. Welcome to the Online Lounge, Network Cork's podcast series.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Online Lounge. I'm Orla McAndrew and I'm a wedding and event caterer, and I'm joined today by Monika Nowakowska and Katie Sloane. All of the conversations for this series are about living better, fuller, more sustainable lives, giving members and listeners information and input they can use in their personal and professional lives. For me, sustainability is about the impact the choices we make have on the way we live in the world, and consequently the world we live in. So I'm delighted to speak to two fantastic businesswomen who each work in the area of sustainability and allow them to tell us all about their businesses. So first up, we have Katie Sloane of Peach Vintage. Hi Katie, and welcome to the Online Lounge.
Thanks for having me, Orla.
Would you like to tell our listeners exactly what it is that you do and how you got into this business?
Sure. So I started Peach Vintage clothing 5 years ago. I realised it was 5 when I saw a Facebook post in February to say, will you all share my new business? But in actual fact, I have been a second-hand and vintage shopper for all my adult life. A little bit of a background, I suppose. I just recently joined Network Cork this year again after maybe a 12-year hiatus. And when I was in Network Cork before, I was in corporate sales, and it was my first experience of going to beautiful events and I suppose getting the opportunity to look gorgeous and wear beautiful clothes. And when I went to the events, people would always say nice things. Oh, where did you get your dress? And I would also always tell this little lie that I'd always know the tag of the dress, and I would say, oh, I bought it in whatever high street shop. But in actual fact, I would have picked it up in a charity shop or a second hand or somewhere vintage, because I was always a little uncomfortable about saying where I got the item.
Isn't that so crazy, really and truly?
Yeah, looking back now, I was just shy. I didn't want to admit that I wore second-hand clothes. It was the weirdest thing. So I went to the States many years ago after I was working in sales, and I really found my people there because everybody was wearing secondhand and everybody was wearing vintage. I felt so comfortable, and I spent a couple of years there, and I ended up buying vintage, like so much vintage clothing, stuff that never even fitted me. I just loved the texture and the feel of the fabrics. And when I was coming home a couple of years later, a friend of mine was coming back, and his whole family were coming home, and they were getting a shipping container, and I asked him, would he bring these 3 massive boxes of vintage clothes back with him? And there was no other reason, just because I loved the fabrics, and I didn't know why I was bringing them back. I had no business idea for selling vintage clothes at the time, and I ended up putting them in the attic for a number of years. And my sister just said to me, she said, what are you going to do with all those clothes? And I was like, I've got so many clothes in my wardrobe as well. I'm going to start up a Facebook page for selling my clothes. And that's how Peach Vintage started.
Isn't that interesting? Because what I'm getting from that, which gives me a little bit of comfort, because I'm only in the initial stages as well of my sustainable journey. And I think sustainability like that, it means so much to so many people. Mm-hmm. And there's none of us experts. You know, yeah. I do what I can in my business. You do what you can. Mm-hmm. But what I got from what you just said is initially you bought all this stuff because you loved it and it was pretty and you liked Absolutely. The touch. You didn't have a particular goal for it. So even someone like you, who I regard as really uber sustainable, yes. You know, you still, you know, grew up in the same society that I grew up in, where things were nice and getting and having was, you know, appealing to you. But I think it's so amazing that you've come further along that journey, and now you've seen a way of not just selling that and using it, but also highlighting the reality of, you know, beautiful things are worth keeping, are worth treasuring, and you're providing people a space not only to buy vintage, but you're a consignment store as well, yeah. Katie. So would you like to tell us a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, sure. So when I started Peach Vintage, it was all my own clothes, and I didn't want them sitting in the attic as well. The vintage pieces especially, I wanted them to be loved. And my own clothes my wardrobes were overflowing. But they were still excellent pieces, and I was buying secondhand all the time, but again, not telling people where I was buying the items. And when I set up the page, it was just myself. And then I started to run out of clothes because I realised people were saying, "Oh, you've got great taste." And I was like, "Oh, that's really nice to hear."
Yes.
But I was never into fashion. I was never into trends. So opening a shop or anything like that would never have been a road I would ever go down, or like, getting a certain style of stock. I love the idea of having just one of everything. And that's how the consignment idea came up, because I started to run out of my own bits. And then my sisters gave me clothes, then my mum and aunts started giving me stuff. And then after, it just snowballed, and it grew so organically, like Peach Vintage has done for the last 5 years, that friends and people I didn't even know were contacting me via Facebook and saying, "Oh, do you sell clothes? I have loads of stuff to sell." So that's how Peach Vintage, it was just completely organic. It all happened by mistake. And like I said, it's lovely that you picked up on that I didn't really know anything about sustainability, because I grew up in the throwaway society. And I was very much fashion oriented, as in like, I have to have the newest thing. And I grew up in that society as well. So it wasn't a thing that I learned. It was a thing that Peach Vintage helped me to learn.
Which is wonderful. And actually, I'm most interested in the effect of industrialisation on the way we work, live and eat. And so in this podcast, it's all about, for me, finding out the impact of that on all of us, unbeknownst to ourselves, and sort of looking under the bonnet and looking for ways that we can do things slightly better.
Yes.
So Monika, it's wonderful to have you here with us this afternoon. Would you like to introduce yourself and your amazing business?
Well, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Monika Nowakowska, and I'm a dressmaker based in Sloane. So I specialize in redoing clothing that are already, in existence and just need a little bit of work, like adjusting or maybe rearranging so it can be worn again instead of rotting at the back of the wardrobe. And I make clothes to measure for people who cannot shop in high street shops.
Amazing. And most recently, you had the great honour of altering Ingrid Seam, our president's dress, for the Business Award ceremony. And that dress had a very special story. It came from her grandmother, and you made it absolutely tailor-made for her. It was absolutely stunning.
Oh, well, it's a gorgeous story in itself. Do you know, when you hear stories like that, the clothes that were bought 50 or 60 years ago, and they still get the second lease on its life, it's beautiful. And it still look good. That dress was worn, I was told, in 1968 by Ingrid's granny to Ingrid's parents' wedding. And it didn't really require much work to adjust it then to Ingrid's body, and she looked absolutely beautiful in it.
She did.
It's a gorgeous dress and a beautiful woman.
So tell me, where did your interest in seamstressing start? Is it something you've always worked in? Did you have other careers before this? I'd like to know more about you.
I was always sewing. My mother was sewing. Both of my grandmothers, the sewing machines were the part of every household when I was growing up. I was always mesmerized by it. And I started because I had a very strong need to be different than everyone else. So when I was growing up in Poland, most clothes, were the same. So in order to stand out, I was redoing, attaching, reattaching, removing sleeves or adding ribbons to my own clothes, so I could be myself rather than, everyone else.
I think that's so wonderful. And actually, it's one of the things there's a gap in our knowledge here in Ireland, where our grandparents would have been sewing and knitting. But even in our parents' time, I'd say all our parents were around the 80s. They've lost that knowledge, and we've lost that knowledge in turn. So actually, it's wonderful to have people in Ireland who are still sewing. And I noticed there's a resurgence in the teaching of sewing, and I'm actually attending classes at the moment myself, because I'd love to be able to pass that on to my children. And I think it's so necessary that we start looking at clothing in a completely different light, that it's not as disposable as it currently is, and that we look at it and respect it in the same way that we respect food, and look at ways of altering it, changing it, and making it last much longer. So I really applaud that you are doing that in this country, and that you are sharing your skills with so many, and letting us realise as well that that's a possibility and it's an option, and we should really be taken up on it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
So my next question, Katie, is You talked about Reworked
Yeah.
by Peach Vintage.
Yes.
I'd love you to tell us all about that.
Yeah. Like you were just saying, my mum actually taught me how to sew. And she worked for a designer when we were all kids. She made curtains, and then she'd make out of the materials. She'd make dresses for all our school plays. So we always heard clack, 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 clack at home in the evening time. Mum was always on the sewing machine. And then I suppose we grew up, and we never taught in school or anything. And I wasn't interested in it as a child or a teenager. But I knew where my clothes were coming from as well, because Mum was making them. And when lockdown happened, I managed to source a hand sewing machine, so I'm really slow fashion. I asked Mum to teach me when we were during lockdown to use the sewing machine, and we worked together. That's all. I'd never used a sewing machine before, and the joy of learning something with my mum, it brought us to like a whole new place. That I wanted to start the business with Mum, and I had all these business names, and Mum was like, "No, this is your thing." So she's just a wonderful person, but so she wasn't interested. She just wanted to teach me and pass on the skill. And I had so many ideas for as I said, when I lived in America, I saw this gorgeous idea at a flea market of a girl making tops from towels. And I was like, God, this is just beautiful. And that was 12, 13 years ago. So it was still in my head all those years later. And I tried over lockdown to source these vintage towels, and couldn't find anything in Ireland. And it turns out when I started talking to my antique friends and that, they were like, we don't have vintage towels here because we use them till the ends, till they go to ribbons. So once we were finished on the dog, we were using them on the floors. So there is no vintage towels to be sourced. So I managed to find people in Holland and people in California to send me 2 boxes of these vintage towels. So
and
they were stunning, absolutely. But when I wanted to start my rework business, I wanted it to be size inclusive and for all body types. That was the idea behind it. But of course, when you fold a towel in half, it only goes to a certain size. So the whole idea, I was so disappointed. I had made all these towels and I wanted them to be size inclusive, and my mind was going to plus size clothing. So then I got the idea for the shawls and the ponchos and the wraps,
which I have to say are absolutely outstanding. They're just so beautiful.
I'm so proud of them. Yeah, I absolutely love them. They're made from vintage materials. Everybody has scarves in their wardrobes, at the back of their wardrobes, and they've just been one of these unique things that I've made that I'm so proud of.
I'd say they're massively popular for the festival scene. They're just that kind of like really standout-ish, unique, stunning piece of clothing that you just know it's a one-off.
Yeah, absolutely. Like where the towel tops have changed to what I didn't think they were going to go down the route of. I wanted to sell them for adults, but they've gone down like for they go off great for teenagers at markets. They love them because they're perfect sizing for young adults and teenagers, and kind of like size 8s and 10s, smaller bodies.
Yes.
But the shawls and the ponchos fit all body types, which is exactly what I wanted them to do. So, the purpose, yeah.
And Monika, tell us about your journey to the Lady of the Valley. You have an actual shop in Schull, and it's absolutely stunning, and I'd love to hear how that came about.
And I think, I just decided at some point to follow my passion, because when it comes to design and sewing, I'm completely self-taught. So as a matter of fact, I failed exams to seamstress school I wanted to go to on maths.
Okay.
And so I ended up in a technical high school of all places, when there was even more maths, ironically. So I if you look at my kind of career, like I'm a technician in gas industry, never worked it. I wanted to study literature, never get to do it. I'm a trained journalist. I used to write for a paper in Dublin. I gave up. I worked millions of jobs. And then I came to Ireland, and no one really cared what I've been doing back in Poland. So my first job was on the English market, dismantling chickens.
So, what a job.
I went within months. I went from working in a gallery to dismantling chickens, literally.
But isn't life strange?
and then I found that kind of lovely, cozy job when you don't have to really worry about anything. And I was a housekeeper for several years. But I'm just, I'm easily bored. So in a place where there is no moving forward, nothing really new to learn, I kind of get restless. So once
you're a creative.
So, I've been self-employed continuously since 1995.
Mm-hmm.
It was always kind of side type of job. It was always more for fun. So I had a craft shop in Kinsale for about 10 years ago, for 2 years, that failed miserably because I didn't know what I was doing business-wise.
The best learnings, let me just say. All the failures.
Yeah, and then after that, I had to rearrange. So I got a day job again, and then started to learn and make connections and networking. And then at some stage, I decided I'm ready. I'm ready to
open a physical shop?
A workshop, yeah.
Okay.
So I have a tiny little workshop now in Skull. I do all my sewing there. I have fantastic customers. The community around Skull is very great and supportive, which makes things so much easier.
And I think a lot of that is as well, it's an appreciative community where farmers markets are thriving, local craftspeople are thriving. There's obviously an appreciation of the actual skill that goes into doing what you do. Like I've seen your coats, you always turn up to network in your own skirts. Your clothes is absolutely stunning, are absolutely stunning. And I love that there's an appreciation for that there. What are your goals for the future for Lady of the Valley?
Well, initially I thought I'll be just making dresses to order. The way it turns out, there's actually more demand for repairing and redoing clothes and, bringing old clothes back to life again. And so the more you talk to customers, the more you realize that there is maybe not as much need for new garments to be made for sale. So I'm working now on an inclusive collection that'll be available for rent rather than
love that.
So that's the project for next year.
That's phenomenal. And actually, just to say, for all these kind of award ceremonies and these wonderful things, for me, it makes absolute sense to rent, because you're wearing some beautiful gowns, you're not paying a fortune of money, and somebody else gets to appreciate it. Again, I just think it's absolutely the way forward. What do you think about where fashion is at the moment? And I know both of you obviously are going to come at this from a biased point of view, because you're living and breathing in, an alternative to what's the norm at the moment. But where do you see fashion going for the future, or what are your hopes for fashion for the future, Katie?
I do a monthly market in UCC, and I notice that the kids are doing kids. I shouldn't really be saying kids. They're swapping their clothes. When I chat to younger people, like they're swapping their clothes and they're buying vintage and they're buying secondhand, and they are going into charity shops. So,
proudly.
Of course, yeah, and proudly, exactly. They're not like me 20 years ago,
shamed.
not saying it, So that's really, really good news. And it's going to be hard to fight the big chains, and a lot of the time I think we're fighting a losing battle there. But what I do think, I suppose, in our own small ways, like I have things like doing clothes swaps are really important, and just realising the importance of the garment, and just giving people the information about where the clothes come from, and not being not preaching to people, because I think that's really important, because I think a lot of sustainability can be very preachy to the people that don't understand, especially where clothes are being made. Like a quick story, I suppose, about like the fast fashion industry. Like if you look at, I'm not going to mention any of the high street brands, but if you look at their clothes 20 years ago, they were falling off. They never fit properly. Now, if you see a high fashion brand, they fit brilliantly. And they look great on people. And you say, where'd you get that? And they'll say the fast fashion brand. And you're like, and then they have this idea that it's it's okay to buy these clothes because they fit really well, and they're so cheap. The £7, you can get rid of them. But the realization is the people behind that piece of clothing, they are making it so incredibly, because they're so skilled. They're excellent at what they do. But they're working 18 hours a day to make them, and they're making hundreds of garments per day in order to feed their families. So we need to let that message come across in a nice way, and I hope that I can educate people in a good way rather than being preachy to them.
I agree with that entirely. And actually, one of the things that I found when I started my zero waste wedding and event catering business, or that side of my business, was a little bit of fear about talking about it, because I'm by no means a sustainability expert. I'm a complete learner in this field, as I think we all are. And I think it's really important that if there are steps to be taken and we see them, we have that choice to take them or not to take them. That's our own business. But the realization that every choice we make really does matter, and that no matter what you're doing, there's something you can do better as well. So I don't claim to be an expert. I'm sure you don't. I'm sure there are areas of your life as well, Monika. We're all sitting here on a sustainability podcast, but we're not here pontificating either. We're just kind of opening the conversation and wondering, what is it that we can do better? And so on that note, Monika, what would your suggestion be to somebody who is listening to this and it is making them think a little bit differently about fashion, and about maybe taking something from the back of their wardrobe and saying, God, I could reuse this, or I've grown out of it, I could get a panel added. What would be the first steps you would encourage people to take?
I'd say just start with opening the wardrobes and look what's inside. Do you know, like the first famous dress that has been redone in a film history is the Scarlett O'Hara famous dress made out of curtains, because there was no other fabric that you could get.
Yes,
and do you know that we all have houses full of fabrics one way or another. So and it's easy to redo all garments or dresses. Just take it, if you can do it yourself, learn how to sew, or take it to dressmaker or seamstress to do it. Last year, I turned beautiful tablecloth into a beautiful skirt. The tablecloth couldn't be used anymore, but we cut around the stains and we made a skirt out of it.
And actually, I sourced some tablecloths from France last year for Katie, and she has done something similar. So it's incredible what can be done.
My collection of linen tablecloths were turned into face masks during pandemic.
Amazing.
Do you know?
So clever.
You don't need to buy, and you see companies more and more introducing sustainable processes. So it's easier to buy fabric that would end up in the landfill that is beautiful, that you can work with. Did you know dresses can be cut into half and turned into tops and skirts, and you can mix and match?
I love the creativity of it, and I think for people who don't have that level of creativity, I would suggest going to somebody like Monika, bringing, if there's a piece of fabric that you love the look of, but it doesn't fit you anymore, or it's torn or it's cut, bring it to somebody who can give it a new lease of life. And that's just a wonderful starting place. And the beauty of that as well, for me, and like you guys, is it's completely unique. And like, we all love fashion. We all love to express ourselves through our clothing. And it's really important that we get to do that, but we can all do it in a more sustainable way. And I'd like to leave you today with one of my favourite quotes, which is, "He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough." And I wonder, ladies, do you have anything similar that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
There's a quote in Polish that says, "Jak się nie ma, co się lubi, to się lubi, co się ma," which means if you don't have what you'd like to have, then you just like what you have already.
Oh, I love that. And Katie?
Just to buy local and buy slowly.
Wonderful. It's been such a pleasure to have both of you, Monika Nowakowska, Lady of the Valley, and Katie Sloane of Peach Vintage. Join us on the Online Lounge on Spotify and YouTube. And if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please leave a review and help us to grow it. I'd like to give my sincere thanks to Network Cork for affording me this opportunity to host a podcast, and also to Coco and team at M5 Sound Studio in Cork City for making this a really enjoyable experience. If you'd like to know more about your host, I'm most active on Instagram as Orla McAndrew Food, and I'd love to see you there. Thank you so much for joining us today.